All right. Most of you, I mean, some of you know Professor Daniel Herman from Central Washington University. He's published three non, what do you call your non, are they articles? What do you call them?
They're books. We call them monographs.
Monographs. Okay, that's the word I was searching for, but they're just smaller books. And one of them, Hell on the Range, is about the Pleasant Valley War, which now, and I'm really curious about your attempt now to fill in some blanks with fiction. And another one that I was really interested in was the history of is it, would you pronounce that word?
Dilzier?
Dilzia.
Yeah.
And Yavapai people of Verde Valley, which is one of our shameful events that what we've done around here. And then you've won two major prizes and a bunch of little accolade type prizes. So, but you're striking out now for fiction. So we'll talk more about that later. Meanwhile, I want to turn it over to you and let's see what happens if everyone be's quiet, everyone get muted, and because Daniel's the one you're here for. So go for it, Daniel. It's all you.
Well, thank you, Susan, for organizing this event and hosting. And thank you, everybody, for coming. It's a pleasure to be able to do this. And I guess I'll just talk a little bit about how this project started. As Susan noted, I did write a nonfiction account of the Pleasant Valley War, which I call the Rim Country War because I link events under the rim in Pleasant Valley with events above the rim, especially in the Mormon communities around Silver Creek. So I call it the Rim Country War, which is not important for purposes of the novel particularly. Although the novel also does link the events, the quarreling between the Grahams and the Tewksbury's with some of the rustling and criminal acts that occurred above the rim. Anyway, so I wrote the book, and of course you end up with all kinds of loose ends and interesting tidbits that you can't include in a nonfiction work. And so I kind of wanted to play with those in a work of fiction. But what I first did is I suggested this as a project to my dad, who I thought was going to be here today. I guess they didn't get it set up, but he doesn't really get on computers very much. But my sister was going to set it anyway. It doesn't matter. So I suggested to Dad that he do a screenplay, and so he did. He has never written a screenplay before, so this was the first, and it was somewhat rough. And so I just basically took over the project from there. He kind of converted it into a novel, but he didn't do a lot with it. It was mostly a short dialogue play set and basically based on dialogue. So I took over the project and I spent many years working on it. And in those years, I did attempt to follow some of the interesting anecdotes and threads that I had been unable to include in the novel, and some of the sort of theories that I formulated that I wasn't really sure about, but I thought they were interesting as speculation. So I incorporated those into the novel, and I can talk about those as we go. The first thing I want to do is just read some fairly short pieces. I'm going to read three fairly short scenes from the book, or they're not necessarily scenes, but vignettes, I guess you'd say. And the first one is in page 6, and this is the scene in which Ben, who's the protagonist, who's a teenager at this point, and he wants to be, he's come to Globe to work in the mines. He's a runaway. His story is based actually on George Hunt's, the first elected governor of Arizona, was a runaway from Missouri and ended up in Globe. So I based Ben's story on Hunt's, and I also have a character that's based on Hunt, and his name is George Hurd, but he's already in Globe by the time that Ben arrives. And so in this first scene, Ben has just been hired as a stock boy in George Hurd's mercantile. Hunt, not Hurd is based on Hunt. Hunt was an ardent reformer who would later play a central role in getting both gambling and drinking banned in Arizona, along with capital punishment. He was also a big supporter of women's suffrage. And of course, that also was passed by, I think it was by referendum or plebiscite. I think it was a plebiscite, actually. And in 1904, Hunt married Helen DeWitt Ellison, who was the eldest daughter of the leader of the Pleasant Valley Vigilantes. He actually didn't live in Pleasant Valley, he lived nearer to Payson at the time. He would later move to Pleasant Valley, but he was the leader of the Vigilantes who took action during the Pleasant Valley War. And so Hunt married his daughter, Helen DeWitt Ellison, who also plays a big role in this novel. So I made Hunt, and of course, again, I called him George Hurd, not George Hunt, an important character in this novel so I could show the reader the political and social tensions in territorial Arizona. I didn't want it to make it all seem like it was, all quarreling, fighting, stock theft, and lynching. It wasn't. There was another side to Arizona even at that time. So here's the short passage. I set out from Tucson with boyish hope in my breast. It wasn't until I'd got a view of the place that my mind registered a twinge of doubt. The man they called the captain halted the mules for respite after we topped the last of the ridges. "That be your globe city," he called to me as he peered into a sprawling basin. I followed the thread of trail that wound ahead. It descended through scrubby hot bushes and spiky mescals, then emptied into a jumble of clapboard and adobe brick, pinched into a barren draw. Blocking the view to the north and westward was a wall of crowded hills. To the east lay a sea of desert. Bony ridges fringed with saguaro cactus stretched all the way to the Indian reservation. I've grown fonder of the country over the years, but at the time it was desolation. After I'd helped with the unloading and getting the mules fed, I took a stroll through my new surroundings. Smack in the middle of town loomed a theater and a sturdy bank like battleships in a fleet of sloops. On the other side of the street stood a couple of hotels and an Oddfellows hall, along with a saddlery and a run of saloons. Accordion bursts spilled from the nearest of them, along with muffled chortles from one of the customers. The only other places worth the noticing were a druggist and a couple restaurants, along with a rambling mercantile called the Globe Commercial. The miners had taken up residence in shanties and boarding houses housed in the streets. The miners had taken up residence in shanties and boarding houses on the streets, spoked from the row of businesses. What few had brought their families tucked themselves into peak-roofed cottages with iron fences. I sweated the night in a boarding house as my mind swirled with scenes from home. Boy, that's got to stop right now. Sorry. I finally lit the lamp by the bedstead and scribbled in my diary. When dawn came, I had my breakfast, then made my way to the mine office. Only when I arrived, I got a surprise. Copper price took a dip, the foreman told me. Won't be any hiring until the bosses raise production. And this was actually true in 1887, that copper prices really did take a dip. Globe did experience a temporary recession with high unemployment. It was very short-lived. Of course, copper was overall in high demand, so I'm not sure what caused this particular dip in prices, but this was part of the economic backdrop for the Pleasant Valley War, so I wanted to get that in there. I marched back to the boarding house and asked for my rent back, then grabbed my haversack and went to wandering. Thought I'd drum up work at one of the ranches or maybe one of the farms on the banks of the Salt. I found a task here and there, digging a well or a shallow privy. I earned enough to fill my belly, but not a penny to spend for pleasure. Then there wasn't any work, dried up like a summer puddle. When I finally tired of searching, I made my way to the Globe Commercial. It was late afternoon when I got there. I took off my hat and slipped through the door. I remember the store like a photograph, but at the time it was a perfect welter. From the door, you could see down a broad aisle ending at a counter where a man in a cravat glanced up from his newspaper. The rest of the floor was quilted with crates and bins and bloated tubs, with tables here and there crammed with mining gear and sets of crockery. I glanced around to get my bearings, then proceeded toward the man at the back. "Looking for something in particular?" he asked. For an offer of gainful employment, I was hoping you might know of someone looking for a hand. I ain't much at stonemasonry, but I can dig a hole good as the next man. That or help with carpentry or blacksmithing, just about any chore suited to a son of a farmer. "Not in a while," he answered as he closed his newspaper. "What's your name?" "Benjamin Holcomb." He looked me over carefully. I don't believe I've seen you before. Are you new here? Came over the Pinal 6 weeks ago. I've been working between the cow camps. I'd been in once to buy coffee and hardtack, but I guess I hadn't made much of an impression. I'm looking for anything I can get, anything that gets me fed. He gave me another once-over, then turned back to his newspaper. I'll keep my ears peeled for you, Benjamin Holcomb. Stop back in a couple of days, and I'll let you know if I've heard anything. If he gave a damn about my desperation, he went out of his way to keep it hid. I thanked him politely and made my exit. I stood holding my hat as I heard the door shut, searching the street for a fellow human. Drops of sweat crawled from my underarms. I finally settled myself on the porch stoop. If anyone showed to buy supplies, I got to thinking I'd offer my services. I sat for a time, feeling the melancholy come spilling over me. A pair of horseflies hovered just out of reach, trading sallies for a patch of skin. From off in the distance came the plaints of a he-quail, a fading note, then a silence, like he was on a vigil for a lost companion. I finally scooped a rock from the dust and gave it a lob. A pleasing thud registered from the side of the shed. I bent to scoop a couple more, then stood to add some force. I was launching another when the door creaked. When I glanced back, I saw the clerk. He stood like a sentinel. Almost closing time, he called out, and I'm nary a shilling richer. Then he walked out on the porch. Judging from how hard those rocks are hitting yonder innocent shed, my intuition tells me something's troubling you. I stooped my head and apologized. I'm about hungry as a prize pig without a nickel to buy a supper. He nodded silently and folded his arms. Can you work a broom? I spun my rock into the dirt. They ain't made the broom that stumped me yet. Thought I was clever to answer with something flip. Well, if you're willing to display your talents, I'll be willing to buy you a meal. He told me his name was George Hurd. He didn't own the entire operation, but he was sure enough managing partner. He'd run away himself, I come to find out, back in '78. Soon as I'd finished sweeping, he did as he promised. He took me to a Chinaman's restaurant called the Irish Parlor that served the wateriest son of a bitch stew under stars and stripes. We chewed gristle and sipped our coffee whilst swapping stories about riding the rails. Then he loaned me a little money so as I could sleep in a boarding house. Told me to hustle back the next day and he'd give me another chore. Pretty soon I was regular, hired me as a stock boy, paid $22 a month and sometimes a little bonus money. Okay, so that sort of sets up Hurd as a character. And of course, the protagonist, Ben, is going to leave Hurd very soon to become an apprentice cowboy. So I also, though, wanted to include some of the social history of Globe and some of the, I guess you'd say, social issues, and particularly in relation to prostitution. So I'm just going to read a short piece, shorter than the last one. And the objective in this passage is for Ben to relate his description of marital prospects and of prostitutes in much the way that real cowboys discussed such things in their memoirs. So I modeled his observations about prostitutes specifically on those of a man named Slim Ellison, who some of you may know who he was. He was the grandson of Jesse Ellison, Colonel Jesse Ellison. Colonel he wasn't a real colonel, but that was his sort of name that was given him. So Colonel Ellison was the vigilante leader, and so Slim was his grandson, and Slim was a very colorful, interesting figure who wrote several memoirs, 2 of them published, and I think there's another unpublished one. In one of those memoirs, Slim wrote a chapter on prostitution in Globe, and he pretty freely admitted that he'd been a client. Okay, it says the host muted me. Am I going on too long here? Oh, now you're muted. Okay, let's see if I can do this here. Can you, participants, chat, screen share, record. So I assume you can't hear me, is that right? No, can't hear me?
We can hear you.
Oh, you can, okay, all right.
You're back.
Okay, great, okay. Okay, I'll just read this next short section. So So what I wanted to do is convey the tragedy and pathos, but I didn't want to go too far in that direction because real cowboys really didn't do that in their memoirs. They were aware that there was a certain level of tragedy and pathos, but of course they also presented these stories in a kind of ribald way. So I was trying to do both at the same time. So Ed's mention of a job, this is after Ed Tewksbury has offered Ben a job as a apprentice cowboy, and so he hasn't taken the job yet. But Ed's mention of a job wasn't the cause of my sickness, but it raised the fever another notch. I should have known better than to consider hiring on with a man in a quarrel, only I never imagined it would come to much. In fact, that gun stuff appealed to my fancy. I hadn't been any faithful son to a devoted father, but there was part of me that wanted to match him. He wasn't but a stripling teen when he'd marched with Sherman through the Carolinas. I'd somehow got to thinking I'd send him a portrait photograph of myself outfitted with a grizzly rifle. Beyond all that lay a loftier vision, a 160-acre homestead in the grassy high country with a couple of thousand heads spread over the range and me as boss. So I think what's important here is that all these guys filed for homesteads, but you could only get 160 acres that way, and you needed a lot more than that to have a successful ranch. You could run a small number of cattle on 160 acres, but you really needed probably several thousand acres to run any substantial number of cattle. And so what they did is they would claim that 160 with water, of course, attached to it. That was very important to get a claim on the water. And then they'd run their cattle on the free range because most of Pleasant Valley and most of the Tonto Basin was unclaimed. It was federal land. Once the Apaches and the Yavapais were removed, it was federal land. So these people ran their cattle on free range. So that's something I wanted to get across. Anyway, if I'd known cattle prices would stay sunk into the 90s, I'd have thought different. Only like most men, I was a pious optimist. The newspaper was talking up a big railroad project that would make the Tonto Basin into a cattle kingdom. Wasn't but 6 months later when that railroad laid off its construction crew and folded. Only by then I was on my path. I had somewhat dimmer visions of a woman to share it with. Not any delicate blossom of a girl woman, but a sure enough one who could ride the fences in a pinch and loosen her hair in the evenings. Not that I had immediate prospects. What few women abided in Globe City were generally of a class that either avoided me or wanted money. Every now and then a married woman would venture into the store to order a harpsichord or a lady's writing desk. They'd sometimes deign to throw a maternal smile or thanks my way, for which I felt more appreciative than I ought. Then there was the other end of things, the sporting ladies. They fell into two sorts, generally speaking. The brothel gals were younger set, Swedes and Mexicans and jet-eyed colored women, and every shade and shape betwixt. Not a one of them but knew her art. They'd put a spell on a man to make him levitate until his wages jumped into their coin purses, only it was the pimps that got the lion's share. The other set were the roomy-eyed laudanum drinkers who'd rent crib berths in the adobe tumbles on the trails to town, the ones that had lost their chance. I took my turns, I'll freely confess, but I never came away particularly cheered. It wasn't that I lacked hope of abandoning bachelorhood. Some of the girls made their way to the grace of matrimony if they found a man with the right attainments, mostly meaning a proper avocation or a sizable herd and enough lip bloom to attest to gravity. Only often as not, it didn't work like that. I knew a cowboy that paid a girl he favored for a week of her company. They strolled like a twosome. At the end of the week, she accepted his marriage proposal. He came near to putting an end to himself when he found she jumped for another town. He never did know whether she was dissembling to him or whether her pimp stole her. Wasn't but a year later when that cowboy got killed in a brothel. One of the whores shot him when he got belligerent. That's based on Slim Ellison's story about his friend who he was his closest friend who he sort of loved as a brother. And this is exactly what happened to this man. I guess I was luckier, or not so full of myself. I wasn't fool enough to think any woman would marry a penniless stock boy, though I had hopes to climb the grade. If I'd stayed with George for another decade, I'd have had the mustache to recommend myself. Likely he'd have made me store manager after he turned his attention to politics. But like half the spikers in the territory, I'd got the idea of forging a shortcut. Figured I'd turn that 10 years into 5 by way of homestead papers and a herd of cows. Okay, now I'm gonna skip the next part. Okay, so should we open it up for questions or should I? Hey, there's my dad. Hi, Dad. Can you hear me? There's my sister and dad. Hi. So Should I open it up for questions, or should I read another short passage?
Whatever you want.
Okay, I'll just read one more then. And let's see, John, are you outside now? Okay. Okay.
But I
I'll
can
read one more
talk.
short passage.
I can talk
And
with her. Hello.
okay, so this is where he's crossing the Hell's Gate Gorge. And so I consulted maps to figure out, how you'd get to Pleasant Valley and to Payson. And of course, there's also, it's in the archives too. There are people that talk about how you got there. It was a pretty remote place, just as it is now. I think that road is still dirt that goes in there. But at the time, there were basically 3 trails leading in from different directions. And one of them was the so-called Hellgate Trail or Hell's Gate Trail. And it passed through the gorge called Hell's Gate, or also called Hellgate. And so I backpacked in there just to see what it looked like. I wanted to be able to describe it accurately into Hell's Gate. And so I did use that. I'm trying to get here. I'm almost here now. And so that trail extends, if you look at an 1887 map, that little trail extends all the way into the White Mountain Apache Reservation, and then it goes all the way westward to Payson. And as I remember, it even goes maybe all the way to Camp Verde from there. I can't remember, but it goes, it's a long trail, and almost for sure that any trail like that in 1887 wasn't something that the military had made. This was an Indian trail. So it passes in the Hell's Gate Gorge because it's a real steep defile. I mean, it's a chasm. And how do you get down and up? And when I got down there, I just couldn't believe that a horse could make that trip, but they can, if you know how to ride, I guess, right? But the point of it was that you didn't have to cross the Hagler Creek Gorge if you went to Hell's Gate, because Hagler Creek ran into Tonto Creek right where Hell's Gate is. And so if you went in below that confluence, you could avoid crossing 2 chasms. So that's why you went in there. As best I can figure it anyway, that's why they made it there. Plus there's a deep, dark pond at the bottom of that. That's a very refreshing spot for a swim or a bath. Okay, so this is from the book. Hooper said to take the left forks, but somehow I took an extra. I got lost in the hills for half the day before I found where I'd gone astray. Every time I came around a bend, I half expected to see a band of Apaches. I finally camped on the lip of Hell's Gate. It wasn't until the next morning that Dorothy Dix, that's his horse, is Dorothy Dix, it's the name of the woman that was in charge of the Union Army nurses in the Civil War, and so he's named his horse after her because the horse is kind of an older horse and she's very gritty. She's not pretty, but she's very gritty. It wasn't until the next morning that Dorothy Dix and I wound our way into the gorge. Looking down into it, I thought I'd found an Eden, all quiet waters and shadows and a canopy of shimmering green. When we got to the bottom of it, we slaked our thirst in Tonto Creek. Then I realized we were boxed. I rode up and down the canyon, searching for a sign of trail. Upstream lay a quiet pool between blackened cliffs that ran to sky. Hagler Creek trickled in through a little side canyon, threading through a bed of boulders. The far side was nothing but tangle. Broken sycamore logs lay heaped like battlements, guarding thickets of box elders and spindly willows twined with tendrils of wild rose. I sat grim-faced atop my skinny sorrel, squinting into the thicket. Finally, I saw a little chute leading up the far wall behind the trees. I had to laugh as I studied it. Couldn't figure how a horse and rider could make the grade without a ladder. I got down and led Dorothy Dix through the knot of tangles, pulling thorn branches away to protect her eyes. 5 steps into it, we were sunk half to the knees. The storms had made a swamp of it. Just when we came out on a bed of talus, I tripped over a loosened root. God damn it, I yelled as loud as my lungs could muster. My curse went bounding across the cliffs, then came circling back like a frighted dog. Blood came oozing from a ragged tear in my hand. We walked along the talus till we finally reached a slide of rocks. I turned upward toward the chute and cursed again, then did my best to lead her. Half an hour later, I came huffing to a sandy ledge. It was getting near evening when I came trotting to the Atkinsons. I followed the trail through a row of apple saplings, then came to a big pole corral that caged half a dozen horses. Just behind the corral stood a palisaded wall. Looked about like an army fortress, except they'd left the gate completely open. As soon as I came through it, I was swarmed by a pack of hounds. A hatchet-faced balding man stood up from a log, casting his long, stooping shadow between giant hides tacked to the barn. I thought they were cowhides, but it turned out I was wrong. They were the first grizzlies I'd laid eyes on. Right beside him stood a skinny young woman holding a horseshoe. She shot me a glance, then tossed it at a peg. I think you got me whipped, Papa, she called out to the bald man. Then she turned toward the dogs with her hands on her hips. Jezebel, scoundrel, loafer, let that man pass. She stood with her lips pursed until the barking petered out. I believe you're Mr. Holcomb, she called out. Yes, ma'am. Mr. Hurd says you have a job for me. We have plenty of work for you, all right, if you're keen to learn the trade. The dogs kept running in circles like it was some kind of big event. Goddamn right, chimed in the old man as he took a tug on his pipe. The thieves took the Mormons for 30 horses last month. They'd like to take my whole herd too if I ain't got men to guard them. If you're an honest man, come for work, we'll happily oblige you. He whistled at the dogs, causing them to slink away. These are for you, Miss Louette, I said timidly as I got off my horse and handed her George's letters. They're from Mr. Hurd. I reckon that Skinny One's a letter recommending me. And so this is the beginning of the romantic correspondence between George, the actual George Hunt, and Helen DeWitt Ellison. And so this is why he's written her a romantic letter, in case you're wondering what's in those letters. Okay, so they're from Mr. Hurd. I reckon that Skinny One's a letter recommending me. I watched nervously as she turned them in her hands. Our man, Mr. Henry, came from Globe ahead of you, she said matter-of-factly as she opened Hurd's recommendation. George told him you might be coming, thought we'd see you long before now. He forgot to tell me about it right away, got lost in his bookkeeping. Didn't come by the way of Hell's Gate, did you? Asked the colonel. Yes, sir, I answered. I rode with a feller from Globe who was headed up the rim. I didn't tell him it was Landis Hooper. So it turns out he didn't know that the guy he rode with to get to the Hell's Gate Trail, who's an experienced hand and knows the land and so forth, and has gone in search of his missing father, who has presumably been murdered in this feud. But he doesn't know that that Landy Hooper, the guy he rides with, is basically a no good neck. But Hooper has got a good side too, and so Hooper has told him, go on and get your job. I don't want you to get you in this mess that we're in with now with the Tewksbury's. So Ben has left and he's gone to take his job here, but he doesn't want to tell the colonel that he rode with Landy Hooper because he knows the colonel will think maybe he's in with thieves. Okay. So the colonel says, well, I wouldn't go that way again if I was you. Better stick to the stage road. Someone's apt to take you for a spy. What with this feud going on? Mr. Henry tells us they had some kind of gunfight yesterday. Heard it straight from Ed Tewksbury. His pipe smoke came out in little bursts as he talked. Was any of them killed? I inquired nervously. His throat bobbed with a quiet chuckling. A couple of them got their heads shot off. Good riddance is what I say. I wanted to ask who was killed, but I was quiet as a rabbit. Papa, cried Louette, her face set in a grimace. They're the Lord's people, same as us. Atkinson opened his eyes wide in mock surprise, then shook his head with resignation. Ben, you reckon you could kill a grizzly if one comes a-chargin'? His eyes glowed down in their sockets like embers from a campfire. Reckon if I had to. Well, you might have to. There's quite a few in these parts. I can see that, I answered as I stared at the bearskins. You appear to be quite a huntsman, Colonel Atkinson. Pa's a huntsman, all right. Takes his dogs out after grizzlies when he ought to be working. It is work. Can't just leave them bears to make hash out of my cows. Anyway, Mr. Holcomb, consider yourself hired. He knows he's hired, Papa. George Hurd already told him. George Hurd told him? Well, no one asked me. No need. No need. Mr. Hurd said this is DeWitt talking, or Louette. No need. Mr. Hurd says he was the best stock boy he's ever had. I didn't bother to explain that he'd only had the one. Stock boy, the colonel cried out in feigned anger. We need a cowboy. I'll teach him, and so will you. I imagine I'll have to. I take orders from my daughter here, Ben. She hires and fires my men and forbids me to drink, curse, and gamble. He blew out another puff of pipe smoke that hit his face, then dissolved. I can't forbid, Papa. I can only counsel. She forbids, Ben. In fact, she was just lecturing before you arrived, but she can't forbid me all the time. Why don't you go install yourself yonder at the bunkhouse? Unpack your things and put them away. Bard's over there now. He'll show you around. That's his foreman, is Bard Henry. I'll swing by later. Me and Bard get together every so often for a game. Louette ain't invited. Okay, well that's, I think that's all I'll read, and then I'll just go ahead and see if anybody wants to ask any questions. I'd love to talk about some of the things I left out of the book too, as well as some of the interesting things that I put into the book.
Yes, and people can unmute themselves now.
Yes.
Yeah.
Eric.
I would like to ask you to
Oh, I got mine. Hey, I can put this back up here. I didn't realize that was all the way down there. Now you can probably see me.
I would like to ask you to elaborate a little bit on the historical context here of this feud or war.
Yeah.
And could you a bit?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, there are a lot of different interpretations of what happened, and I have my own, and I happen to think mine is probably the best. But I can't say that. There's been a lot of good literature on the Pleasant Valley War, but essentially, it's, first of all, there's a tension between the Tewksbury family, who were a mixed blood family. Their mother was probably a Hoopa Indian from California who had died when they were boys, when they were very young. And I guess there were 4 of them. And they settled in Arizona. Their father had probably been to Arizona as a military scout for General Crook earlier on. And so they come to this place that's sort of just opened up once the Cibecue Apache get put on the reservation, then Pleasant Valley is opened up for settlement. So they go there, and then the Grahams come in. They're from Scotland, or their dad is from Scotland. The eldest son had also been born in Scotland and spoke with a Scottish accent. The 2 younger sons apparently didn't speak with a Scottish accent. I'm not sure if they were born in Scotland or not, but they spoke just like an American would. And so they were friends initially, but they became enemies in a quarrel over what may have been that they were participating together in rustling from a man named James Stenson, who was another rancher in Pleasant Valley and was the biggest rancher there in Pleasant Valley. And they thought he was bulldozing the range, as they said. They thought he was trying to basically control the range. And so the Grahams ended up testifying against the Tewksburys for rustling. And then in that testimony, which was in Prescott in 1884, then it was determined in some way, I'm not sure exactly, but that they were perjuring themselves. And so they were then accused of perjury, and the whole thing got dismissed. And they were nobody was ever convicted for anything. So that left a kind of smoldering bitterness there. What's that?
Someone's unmuted and stuff's going on in their room.
Oh, somebody's got a TV on or something, maybe.
Yeah.
Okay.
Now now they've muted.
Okay. So meanwhile, the other thing that's very important is that the Hash Knife the Aztec Land and Cattle Company, which is popularly known as the Hash Knife for the brand they use, is a gigantic cattle company owned by Northeastern investors, very wealthy men, and they buy 1 million acres of railroad land. Well, they can control 1 million. I think they buy 500,000, but they end up controlling 1 million because they get the alternate sections that are government land too, basically. And they run out everybody that's been using that land along the railroad, along the Atlantic and Pacific Railroad. Much of it was good land. Some of it wasn't, but a lot of it was good range, and it abuts the Mogollon Rim, and it's in the wetter area where on the west at least, toward Flagstaff. So they run out everybody up there, including the sheep herders. The Daggs brothers are the most notable sheep herders. There were also a lot of New Mexicans run sheep in there, and they hire these mean Texas cowboys, the meanest sons of bitches they can get, to run out these people that are using that land. And so this creates kind of a cascade where the sheep end up being pushed out and into Pleasant Valley and elsewhere. and one of the Tewksbury's ends up becoming a sheep herder for the Daggs brothers. And so there was a fury about sheep because sheep were thought to eat the range to the bone. And there was probably some truth to it if you overgrazed it, right? You could have sheep and cattle, but you had to really keep your eye on how many you had there. And basically everybody was using free range because it was free range. Anybody could run their stock on free range. So you could bring as many sheep as you wanted, you could bring as many cattle as you wanted, and everybody knew that if the sheep came in along with the cattle, that they were going to overgraze. So there was this bitterness and there was this attempt to keep the sheep out. So that's part of it. Now the sheep, the Tewksbury's end up allying with basically the sheep herding faction, and the Grahams end up allying with the faction that wants to keep sheep out of the valley. And so that creates a situation. Then you've got rustling, and I have a whole theory about that I go through in my monograph, and it's sort of implicit in the novel as well. But basically that the rustling was revenge rustling, that somebody got mad at somebody else and they go and steal a cow, and then they go and steal back from the other person, and pretty soon it got out of hand, and they were burning one another's ranches and they were shooting at one another and so forth. So all of this gets out of hand, but a lot of it is just basic resource competition. Basically everybody wants the grass and the water, and there's not enough to go around. And so they're furious at one another, and they start stealing from one another and fighting. And it spills over into the Mormon towns because there's also an anti-Mormon persecution that's going on at the time. Mormons have just recently gotten there. They've only been there for a few years. And these cowboys despise the Mormons. And these cowboys they're Protestant. If they're religious at all, they're Protestant. And they don't like these Mormon polygamists. And a lot of these Mormons were polygamists because that's the reason for settling Arizona was to protect the polygamists from being prosecuted in Utah. And they, of course, also at the same time open up their colonies in Mexico, and Arizona's kind of a way station so they can get away from prosecution. So there's kind of a war against the Mormons, and part of that devolves into simple stock theft. So the Mormons are furious. Their stock is being stolen all over the place. Meanwhile, there's all sorts of theft in Pleasant Valley itself. Who knows who's doing what? It's not really clear who's doing what. And I think kind of a lot of the different people were rustlers. And there's no good and bad. And so I wanted to make this crystal clear in my book. There are interpretations that suggest that there was a good side and a bad side. If you read Jenks Pyle, and he wrote a fantastic book about this. He's from Payson. He comes from one of these old ranching families. He heard a lot of stories about the Pleasant Valley War, and he put them down in this wonderful book he wrote about it. Lots of new information there, but he basically says that the good guys were the Tewksbury side and their allies, which was the side his family was on. And I don't see it that way at all. I see it as a much more mixed. I think nobody was good, nobody was evil, nobody was good. It was a very mixed up situation. And so I tried in this book to make sure that that there's no real bad guy. I mean, the worst it gets is probably Jim Houck, who was a deputy for Commodore Perry Owens. He's kind of, if there's anybody that's a bad guy, maybe it's Owens and him, but even they have their redeeming qualities. So, so I just, that's what I wanted to, so I didn't want to make, that's why it's an anti-Western, I call it. I'm probably going on and on here, but that's why I call it an anti-Western, because in a typical Western, you have your good guys and your bad guys. You have your lawman, your sheriff who goes after the real baddies, or the good gunfighter and so forth. And this isn't like that. In the real Pleasant Valley War, I don't think was like that at all. And I think much of what happened in the West wasn't like that. Much of it was this mess, this sociological mess caused by range, by competition for resources, and by the basic toughness of these people. And these are, Jenks Pyle said, men of action. They're very, they're people who take action. They're not about words and diplomacy. So that's the backdrop.
More questions?
I thank you for that. Great.
Shirley, do you have a question?
Yeah, I'm intrigued by the role that the vigilantes played, and what was their impact on all these other factions?
Yeah, so that's a super interesting question, and it's one that's very controversial. I have a colleague of mine, Edward Pagan, who teaches at Arizona State, wrote the most recent book on the Pleasant Valley War, and it's extremely well written. But I think he and I have some major disagreements. I read it in the draft form. I actually haven't read the published version, so I'm not sure to what degree he incorporated all my or answered my quibbles about his theory. But basically, he doesn't think the vigilantes were important very much, and I see them as absolutely central to the whole thing. And so, I have argued I wrote an article in the Journal of Arizona History and basically argued that arguably, not definitely, but there's circumstantial evidence to indicate that most of the killing was actually vigilantism. Okay, so the Tewksbury's were on the vigilante side, and the governor approved their actions and said, I won't prosecute you if you kill off those Grahams. And there's two sources that say that, two, I think, believable sources that say that the governor gave them permission to do this. And so a lot of the things that weren't necessarily lynchings were still vigilante actions. They were ambushes and shootings, basically, that were vigilante in nature. So there's one of the people named Al Rose who gets murdered in the course of this by the vigilantes. But he had given the names of, or he said that he knew the names of this vigilante group, and he was going to hand it over to the authorities. He tells one of the what's it called? The coroner's posse comes to after Billy Graham, the youngest of the Graham brothers, had been murdered, and Rose says, "Look, I know who did this. There's a list. They have a kill list. They have a hit list. They're going to get rid of all these people, and I can turn this over to you, but I can't do it right now because it's not safe." And then a month later, he's killed. So he never gets the chance, apparently, to do that. And then at the end of the war, Tom Graham gets killed in Tempe while he's a farmer at this point. Years after the fighting, been over for 5 years. And apparently the reason they determined that they had to kill him was because they had word that one of the people that lived in Pleasant Valley had given him the list of vigilantes, and he was going to come after them, or he was going to send somebody else to do so. But in the middle of that is the Stott killing. And this is what's interesting to me. A lot of these odds and ends that I didn't put into the monograph, the historical text that I wrote, I put into the novel. One of them is Jamie Stott, who was a well-educated, well-spoken, very good-looking man who came to Arizona to be a horse rancher and was connected with, had grown up across the street from the governor of Massachusetts, who was one of the investors in this big cattle company that comes in. And so who was Jamie Stott? And he gets hanged along with two of the men that had worked for him. He gets hanged. And he's accused of various things, which I won't go into, mostly horse stealing. And so there were a lot of people that argued that he was completely innocent. He was victimized. And I found some inclination to think, and this is something for Old West buffs, probably they're going to be like, no, I don't think so, but that he might have been gay. And I don't think that this was like Brokeback Mountain or anything like that. I don't think they went in and lynched him because he was gay. That's not what they did. I don't think there was any evidence of anti-gay persecution in the Old West any more than there was at any other time or any other where. But what I do think is that he was considered different, and kind of he spoke too well. He spoke fancy. He wrote his mom and his sister all the time, and he wrote them that he was voting for the prohibitionist candidate for president. He said, well, he couldn't actually find the elector on the ballot that supported a prohibitionist, so he just refused to vote at all in 1884. And then he said, I don't go to the fiddle dances. You know, why would you not go to the fiddle dances? Because that's where you're going to meet women. Well, he doesn't go to those. He says, you know, I haven't seen a woman in 2 years or something like that. And when I do, they ignore me, probably because he was meeting Mormon women. But and then when they hanged him, they tie a silk scarf around his neck. And they make a big point of this. Osmer Flake in his reminiscence, it was not really, well, it is a reminiscence, but his little story about what happened, which is very, to my mind, very one-sided, very, very much the Mormon point of view. But he mentions this silk scarf. And I just wondered, why did they do that? Because it seemed it was part of a torture. They actually hauled him up and down on the tree before they killed him. They hauled him up and down several times. So they would let him down to regain his breath, and then they would pull him back up. And meanwhile, he had this scarf that was tied around this seemingly a fancy scarf. So it seemed to me they were mocking him in a way. I could be wrong about that. But there were some other things too that just struck me as, what was he doing? Why would he leave? He had a wealthy father in Massachusetts. He came from a very high status background. He had all sorts of opportunity open to him in business, and the world was his oyster. And why does he come to Arizona and sort of live by himself? And he invites his mom and sister. They actually come and visit him shortly before he was lynched, maybe a couple months before he was lynched. And so, you read these letters to his mom and sister that Lee Hanchett published, and they're fascinating, and they're sad, because he seems to have been a really good, decent person. And these accusations against him, I'm inclined to think that he overacted the part of the tough guy. And he did that occasionally vis-a-vis Mormons who were in his midst. They settled around him, and others. And I'm inclined to think that. And I'm also inclined to think that he was not so much stealing stock as he was probably capturing young horses that hadn't been branded. This was the same thing with cattle that you call mavericking, where if a young animal isn't branded and it's not with its mother and it's on the range, you can grab it and it's yours. Okay. And I think that's what he was doing. And I think the Mormons really thought he was taking their horses that they had left out, because it was typical practice that you left the horse with its mother on the range. You didn't break it. You didn't go out and catch it until it was maybe a year old or something like that, at which point then you would break it and train it and so forth. But for a long time, it would just be out there. And those are the horses I think he was getting. And I think he had a legal argument to make that was a legal way to take horses. And he was very good at it. He and his partners. And by the way, one of his partners was a guy named Daniel Boone Red Holcomb. And that's who Ben Holcomb, the protagonist, is modeled on. And here's what I know about Daniel Boone Red Holcomb. He was a bachelor all his life. And later in his life, he lived in a small cabin near Heber. And he had a few cattle. And that's who Ben Holcomb is supposed to be in the book. And in the time of warfare, someone left a note on his door that said, "Go," meaning get out or you'll be killed. You'll be lynched. And he didn't go. And he somehow made friends with the Mormon settlers who were there. And he would show up at the Turley's house and he would have dinner. He would always tell them it was his birthday. And he'd say, would you mind? And they would give him dinner. And the reason we know a lot of this is because a Mormon forest ranger later on wrote about it in his memoir, wrote about going and checking in on this older man. He probably would have been in his 50s or 60s at this point when this ranger would check in on him. And the ranger, and whose name escapes me right now, but he said, I didn't bring up the war with him because I knew he would dispute my version of events. He wouldn't see it that way. So we never talked about that. But he would make sure this old rancher had his supplies and was getting along okay. And so that was the mysterious person that I wanted to place at the center of the story. So that's who Ben Holcomb is modeled on. I know nothing other than that about Daniel Boone Red Holcomb, the real guy, but just these interesting tidbits.
I have a question, Dan.
Sure.
I spend a fair amount of time docenting at our little museum in Pleasant Valley. And the museum is co-located with the cemetery. And we have a lot of visitors to the museum. And invariably, the first question they ask is, how many people were killed in the, quote, Pleasant Valley War? And I say quotes because I've seen, figures from the 20s on up to the 40s. And you talked about the vigilantes. And I've heard local people say who, like Jinx Pyle, have been the recipient of the oral history being passed down, that the Pleasant Valley War afforded a lot of people the opportunity to settle scores with their neighbors or someone else that they had a feud with.
Yeah.
So what's the number that you would attribute to the actual Pleasant Valley War?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say there's 19 for certain. Okay, 19 documented for certain deaths related to the war, and then how many people in addition to that that really were sort of semi-documented or were not even mentioned at all. And that's a very difficult question, because I don't think everybody killed in that war would necessarily have, those deaths wouldn't have been recorded. A lot of people came in, apparently a lot of people were brought in by both the Grahams and the Tewksbury's from outside. And if they got killed, then their deaths may well have just been unrecorded. And then, as you say, there was probably this, just like in many wars, this happens that, when there's a war, then somebody who has a score to settle uses the excuse of the war to settle the score. But I would say, I also think that the vigilantes were active all over Apache County. So they were, and they might have been active in Yavapai too. At that time, there was no Navajo County. It was just Apache bordered Yavapai, and then Gila was right below that. And so I think probably they were active in Yavapai and Apache both, but I know for sure in Yavapai, or sorry, in Apache. And they were active all across Apache County, all the way stretching from those little towns in Silver Creek, and then of course Canyon Creek, where the Blevinses had their ranch, the OW. They were active all the way through there, all the way over to St. John's. And so if you add up all the people in that 1887-88 period when Owens was the sheriff, and Owens would have been kind of one of the people responsible for this. I mean, he would have had to endorse it, basically. He deputized some of these guys, including several of the Flake family, and probably including Tom Horn. Tom Horn said in his memoir that he was deputized by Commodore Perry Owens, and I believe him. But there was a lot of killing that went on east of Pleasant Valley in the vigilante campaign that isn't included with what happened in Pleasant Valley. And then there's also, Jinx mentions some of the sheep herders that were killed before the official war started. And there's a couple of those guys. One of them actually is sort of like, he's kind of right when the war starts. And there's another one that was earlier. I don't know much about him, but, and it's hard to say, who killed these guys and why. There's different stories. I have a picture I'd love to show you. If you want to, well, I don't know, it's pretty gruesome. Want to see a gruesome picture? Probably not, but
Yeah.
you want to see it? Okay, I'll show it. I'll see if I can pull it up here and share screen. It might work or it might crash, but let's see if I can do it. I want photographs. I think I'd better not try it. I think I'd have to do a funny maneuver to access my computer at work to get it up. So I don't have it on this computer, unfortunately. Let me just make sure of that. Oh, that's me. No, I'm sorry to say. Well, anyway, it is this sheep herder who was killed early in the war, and Sheriff Mulvinen of Yavapai County came and did the I guess the investigation and photoed him. He's been shot in the head, and so it's a photo of this guy, and I'm struggling to remember his name. He had settled earlier on in the Camp Verde area, then he had moved up onto the rim, and he was in an area that was where the Daggs brothers and the Hash Knife were sort of duking it out for control of this, what was very good range, was the best range in the Hash Knife territories. They said it was at a place called Pine Springs. And the Daggs brothers actually ended up getting it in court. But before that, there apparently was some some fighting that went on over who had the right to that place. And this guy lived right by Pine Springs. And so it may have been, his death may have been connected to that. It's hard to say. One story was that it was a transient who murdered him because the transient had tried, I think was going to buy a horse from him. And the man had pulled out that was murdered, had a money belt, and he pulled his money out of his belt and he saw how much it was. And so the transient came back later and murdered him. And then later, the story that was told was that the murderer was Andy Cooper, or one of his brothers. Hamp Blevins was his brother. They were half brothers. They were all Blevinses really, but Andy Cooper had a fake name. And so, was it true? Did Hamp Blevins or Andy Cooper do it? I don't know. The stories are confusing, but certainly people wanted to believe that that was the case. And both Hamp and Andy Cooper were dead before they could ever, go to court about that. So we don't really know the full story. But yeah, I'd say a lot more people were killed than 19. That'd be my guess. But I know that 19 are confirmed. You may have a different opinion on that. I mean, I know you're an expert too, so you may have a different number in mind. What's your opinion on that?
No, I think by no means am I an expert or scholar on the war, but living here, you can't help but be kind of consumed by it, especially where I live. We live, Hagler Creek runs through the ranch, and the sheep driveway also runs through the ranch.
Wow.
So it's, we're kind of in the center of it. But
That's neat.
I would have thought about 26 or 27, that I've counted that have kind of been associated either directly or on the fringe of the war.
Right.
And just a little note that you might be interested in, talking about the gruesomeness of the war. Reportedly, the first, as advertised here in the area, the first person killed was a shepherd. And actually, it is marked with a Forest Service marker as here lies the first man killed in the war. However, it's in the wrong location, and Jinx Pile has it in the correct location and gives the GPS coordinates. But that particular killing has also always been referred to as one of the most gruesome because reportedly the shepherd was beheaded. And I thought maybe that's where you were going with the photograph.
No, I have. Yeah, no, this is a different sheep herder, and Jinx says he was a sheep herder. This man I'm thinking of, I don't know why I can't think of his name. I'm just drawing a blank right now, but you'd probably recognize the name, but he wasn't really connected to the Grahams or Tewksbury's. And Jinx said he was a sheep herder, but the newspaper stories on his death report that he had 400 cattle. So did he have both sheep and cattle? I don't know. But it's neither here nor there. But that shepherd, I know Jinx said that's Jinx's biggest contribution, is that he says that shepherd I think that man was a Basque, by the way. I almost undoubtedly a Basque. I don't think he was Ute or Navajo or Mexican. I think he was Basque. And he was apparently the brother-in-law of Jim Houck's wife. And that's what Cook Larson said later on. Anyway, Jinx, said that, hey, this was blamed on Andy Cooper and the Grahams. And in fact, it was the Colcord brothers that did it. And they wanted to blame the Grahams because they wanted to stir up trouble because they wanted both the Grahams and Tewksbury's out. And so they left tracks to the Graham ranch to implicate them. And so, Jinx also says that he doesn't think they really cut the head off. He thinks that was an exaggeration. I don't know, and nobody knows. I mean, there are certainly several press reports that they cut the head off. So it could well be, and I did run across the fact that Apaches would sometimes cut the head off of someone they killed because it was a kind of an insult to the soul. The soul wouldn't be able to find its way. And so my guess is that shepherd wasn't killed by Apaches, but that somebody might have chopped the head off to make it look like Apaches is a possibility. And that's the thing, is that there's also Apaches. There are renegades in this time. They haven't all just blithely accepted the reservation life yet. There's still people coming into Pleasant, as you know, I'm sure, but there's still people coming into Pleasant Valley, and sometimes these murders get blamed on them, and they're not responsible, and sometimes they might be. I know there's a very famous case of 3 of them who were convicted of murdering somebody, and almost undoubtedly didn't do it. The evidence was extremely weak against them. I can't remember the whole story. This is right after the Pleasant Valley War. It wasn't during it, but so there's so much going on that it's really hard to know who's doing what and when and so forth.
More questions?
Dan, do you want to talk about the map making process?
Yeah. Okay. I think I can show you the map. So my childhood friend, my best friend, my oldest friend, John Hansen, who's here with us today, John the Woman is how he is signed on. It's an old joke between he and I that goes back to when we were about maybe 8 years old. He did the map for me. And so I will bring up a picture of the map here and show you this lovely map that he made. I can't show it in the whole thing. I can show it in 2 parts because I've got a PDF here. And I'm going to shrink the size. How do I do that? Let's see. There we go. Okay, so okay. So I'm going to share screen, and you should be able to see it, I think, when I share screen. Share screen. Okay. Can you see it now?
There it is.
Okay, so this is, the map runs across 2 pages, and I can't show that. That's all I've got is a PDF, but this is only a corner of it. This is just the upper left corner, but it's this amazing map that he and I worked for a very long time getting just right. So here you see there's the Verde River and Camp Verde, and then over here is Payson. And let's see if I can drag, let's see if I can go over a little bit here. Might have to. Okay, that's not going to help, huh? Yeah, I'm not sure how to make it. Huh, let's see if I can just do it this way. Oh, okay. Anyway, so you got the idea. Now I'm not for here. I know, because you have to go to this page. Okay, there's Pleasant Valley, and there's the Hellgate Trail. And here's the Naglin Rim, which is kind of a little rim that runs below the Mogollon Rim. And then the Mogollon Rim, which is this cliff. And so here's Ben Holcomb goes from here. He starts out in Globe, and he takes this Jerked Beef Butte Trail over the Sierra Ancha to Pleasant Valley, and then he splits off at the Hellgate Trail right here, and he goes west to work for Colonel Atkinson, who's Colonel Ellison in real life. So that's his route, and it's a real route. So I followed geography as carefully as I could. I wanted to get the geography right. I'm sure there are things I didn't get right, but there are a lot of things hopefully I did get right. So
yeah, we worked hard on compiling source data. Dan had done a good job in his research of capturing old maps. So all of the features that are on the map are positioned correctly and reflect the political boundaries from the time of the story. And so those of you who live in the area could use this to navigate around and just get rid of Google Maps, because this is, no, I'm teasing, but that this reflects accurately where things were. And in reading the story, I do find that myself, I love to be able to refer back to the map and see where the story is taking place. So encourage you to do that when you get a chance to read the book yourself.
Yeah, Yeah, we worked on this map very hard, especially John, and it's a wonderful map, and it is pretty darn accurate. And it's got these little place names that you wouldn't even, people don't even know about today. It doesn't have all of them. I didn't want to put everything in, it would be too crowded, but there's some things on here that, like the Jerk Beef Butte Trail, nobody even know about that today, but there it is on the map. And here's a stage road. You can see there's a stage road that runs up to Payson too. So that had just been built, the stage road, but that's not the way Bend goes. So I wanted to say there's some really, there's some really great vignettes that I left out of the book. The publisher made me take them out. The editor made me remove them, but not because they were poorly written, but we had to have a short book. And so they were written in third person omniscient. They weren't written in the first person. And some of them are about the women in the book. And one in particular, I wanted to say that there's two important women in the book. One is Louette Ellison, as I mentioned, or Louette Atkinson, who's modeled on Helen DeWitt Ellison, who was the wife of the first elected governor of Arizona. So her story is very interesting, and I present her in a fairly authentic way, although I make her a little tougher than she really was. And then there's also a half Paiute woman who was married to a Mormon polygamist who figures in the second half of the novel. And she is also based, well, she isn't a real person, she's fictional, but her mother is based on a real person who was a Paiute who was enslaved, basically. Well, if you want to call it, there's dispute. I don't want to use the word enslaved, but a Mormon missionary named Taylor Crosby bought her from her grandfather in about 1862 in southern Utah. And she ends up in Snowflake, and she has 3 children. They were all boys, I believe. And so they grew up. And then in 1913, we find that she appears enrolling in the Moapa Reservation as a Paiute. And so her story was fascinating to me. And so I modeled this character that Ben falls in love with, whose name is Callista. I modeled it on this real woman's daughter, as if she had a daughter. So that's who that's based on. And there's a lot of more authentic details in there that I used, but that was another story that just captivated me. And so I wanted to get it into the novel. I couldn't fit it into the monograph at all. It didn't work there. But they made me take out one of the chapters on her. She still is a big character, but so yeah.
Dan, I have one more question.
Sure.
I know we're focused on your novel right now, but I have a question that pertains to Hell on the Range.
Sure.
And it's, you address something that none of the other books on Pleasant Valley War have addressed at all, and that is an overlying cause, if you will. What was in these people's minds, where normally something would have been solved with a fist fight or an argument, turned into this bloody feud. And my question is, could you expound on that conflict between the honor and the conscience?
Oh yeah, I'm glad you asked, because a lot of people don't like that book because it has that honor conscience theme, which I pounded on way too heavily. It's just mentioned way too often to the point of distraction, and I'm sorry I did that. But anyway, I do. Okay, so historians, first of all, historians tend to not view past human actors as any different, having a different emotional makeup than we have today. And I think that's a profound mistake. I think these people's emotional makeup, the emotions and the course of action that they would perceive as, that they would pursue in any given situation, they just had a different mental map than we do. And so they were given to action. It's what I call honor. Jinx Pyle calls it men of action, and I just call it honor. But it means they were more ready to resolve a quarrel with violence, whether it was in the form of fisticuffs or pistol whipping or stealing, or just stealing somebody's stock or burning their ranch or getting it. And so the West was there different. There's the whole historiographical dispute about whether the West was violent, whether that is the, not the Indian wars, but just the settlement was violent or not. And there have been some important historians that say, oh, no, if you look at a Western town, no more violent than New York, or less violent than New York City. Well, okay. But if you look at the outlying areas in addition, and you're going to find, I think you're going to find the murder rate was very high all over the West. It wasn't just in Pleasant Valley, but obviously there were places where where the murder rate was much higher. But you look at go back and look at the records of the coroner. I mean, there were just all kinds of murders for a very small population. It was a very high murder rate, and in Arizona more broadly. And so this is just a small part of that. But I call that honor that these people had grown up. They were Western people, many of them, not all of them. Some of the ones were from Europe, were not from a Western background. Their family had not been pioneers. And I don't think they weren't the ones that really were the troublemakers here. But the ones that had been, and their families had been in various frontier situations, I think, you grew up with an ethic of toughness that was inculcated into you from the time you were a boy or a girl, either one. And I think you ended up with just a different kind of way of looking at the world. It wasn't like you had to solve every quarrel with your fists or your guns, not like that at all. But you were more assertive in that way, more physically assertive. I think people tended to be more quickly physically assertive. And so I call that honor. And then conscience is what I associate with Governor Hunt and his campaign to, basically he was an exponent of the ethics of the middle class, the urban ethics of, that were more important and becoming very important in Phoenix and Tucson. But he didn't want all this fighting. He didn't want all this violence. And drinking was part of it too, was part of honor culture, and gambling. And he wanted to clean all this up. And so that's what I call conscience. So he's at the other end of this thing. Some people say he actually participated in one event in the Pleasant Valley War. I tend to think he didn't. But at any rate, as a politician, his dedication was to getting rid of gambling, drinking, getting rid of capital punishment, which he managed to abolish for a few years, and then giving women the vote, and various other reforms of that nature. And so I call that conscience, and my book is really about the tension between those two things in Frontier Arizona. That nonfiction book is about that, Hell on the Range. And by the way, if anybody, the letters between, I wrote one chapter based on the letters between Helen DeWitt Ellison and George W.P. Hunt, and they didn't marry they exchanged letters for 13 years before they married. And it's got this poignancy. It's a very dramatic story and full of ups and downs. And at one point, Hunt says, don't write me ever again, because it hurts me too much when you do this. If you're not going to leave your dad to come marry me, it's hurting me too much. Never write me again. And she doesn't for several years. And then they resume, and they finally did get married. But that is a very compelling story and interesting in its own right. And my friend Joan Clark has her own take on that. She kind of thinks that Helen DeWitt Ellison kind of wasn't that in love with George, and that's why she didn't go. I don't know about that. But the letters are very beautiful, and it's an interesting story in itself.
Does anyone else have any questions? I think you still have the shared screen, Daniel.
Right.
And
Yeah.
also it flashed on, but now it's not on, saying your bandwidth is low. I don't know what that means. You haven't disappeared. You have
I bet that I bet it's because it should be high again.
Yeah.
This is probably okay. And I'm not sure how to get everybody back on the screen here.
Well, I think it's a shared screen that is doing it.
Oh yeah. You're right.
You can get it off the
of
shared
course.
screen, then we can do it.
Right.
Yeah, we're a sidebar right now.
Yeah, little one, which is okay.
And I can't find now where the shared screen command is. It's not letting me do that.
Technology.
Dan, this is your sister. Go to the top of the screen and you'll see a little green bar and then a little red bar next to it. It says stop share. Press stop share.
No, it doesn't have that, Lucy.
Bummer.
It's in a little window now. I can't get it to be back to the big window. I can't figure out how to make it to the big window.
Okay, down at the one of the corners of probably the upper right, there's a little set of 4 gray boxes. I think if you click on that, it'll go to the big window. Do you see that?
2 gray boxes.
Nope.
4 gray boxes.
Yeah, try. Yeah. Okay.
Hold on a second. I'm going to try
We
something.
all might learn something here, huh?
Okay, now why is it still not doing it? Yeah, I can see all of you, but I can't get the command on to stop sharing the screen. So
Okay.
maybe if I just, oh, stop, there it is. It's on the other screen. That's where it is. Okay.
Woohoo, you did it. Yay.
Sorry about that.
Okay, now we're set.
So anybody else have any question?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah,
go
this
ahead.
is Tom. Dan, one of these days when we open again at Boyan Plaza in Miami, it would be to have you come down and books if you'd consider it.
I would absolutely love that. Please do. I would love that.
Yeah, that's Dr. Pagan was there a few months ago, and he had a pretty good crowd just before everything hit. So it would be nice when we open again to be able to do that and do a book signing and get you down there to talk.
Absolutely. I wanted to do this. Of course, I was contacting, not everybody, but I was trying to contact some of the libraries and bookstores and so forth. And so I was lucky enough to get Susan to set up this event. But with COVID, it just, the book came out in June and there was nothing I could do. Nothing, so unfortunately.
Could you all tell us how we can buy books through Peregrine and not Amazon?
Yes.
We have it on our website, and we're going to send out probably this link. You're probably not on our newsletter,
I don't think so.
because then you would get the link set out to you with the link to this. You could sign up, but it is on our web page. If you know, www.peregrinebookcompany.com, and there should be links there that will help you to buy the books online, because most of you aren't in Prescott. If you were in Prescott, there's also curbside.
Yeah.
And if all fails, you could call the store. If the technology sometimes fails, the store number, which is 928-445-9000, and they will do it that way. So, whatever we can do to keep Amazon from doing its evil deeds, we'll do. Thank you for asking that question, by the way. Yeah, this is a really fine book. And I think we should get, if we get enough people, we could get book plates and send them to Daniel to sign them.
I'd be happy to.
Yeah. See if we have any in the store right now. Sometimes we used to have a little stationery store. We'd go buy a bunch there, support them as well. But they are fairly well closed. So, just for the COVID, but the world is certainly different. And I do want to thank all of you for coming. This was a wonderful, wonderful presentation, Daniel. And
Thank you.
great questions people asked. Just really interesting. And one thing I wanted to ask, so is I'm really interested in your book about
Dilge?
the Yelp Apaches and all that stuff. And where is that available?
University of Arizona Press or Amazon. There is a digital version. It has not sold as well as I would like, but it's out there. And I'm just going to just be egotistical and say it's pretty well written. It is a sad story, as you say. It's a very tragic story, and it's not a story that people really want to go back to, but necessarily. But yeah, but it's only they didn't put it in a paperback, but it does have an electronic version if anybody wants to buy that. But also the hardback is available from University of Arizona Press, and if you wanted to carry it in the bookstore, obviously you could order it for the wholesale cost from U of A Press.
Yes,
What's
we might just do that.
Title again, Dan?
Rim Country Exodus. Rim Country Exodus.
Thanks.
Yes, we'll go to the, did you say University of Arizona Press?
Yes.
Or, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, it's easy with title and publisher. That's fine.
Yeah.
Good. Thanks.
And I've got an article forthcoming in the Journal of Arizona History on it is again my interest was piqued by this story of this Paiute woman who ended up in Snowflake. So I've written an article on the history of Mormons and American Indians in Arizona. So if anybody's interested, if you get the Journal of Arizona History, it's going to be a special issue upcoming in October. And I worked really hard on that one. So if you're interested, that's out there. I don't know how you get it though, unless you subscribe, because they don't have any online presence, at least yet. So it's almost impossible to get their articles.
Yeah, that would be a problem. Some of the colleges used to have that kind of thing in their library, and they still might. So that's another possibility.
You can always join AHS, and that gives you the publication.
Yes.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you, everyone. Unless you have more questions. I know it's such a strange thing when you can't hang around, mill around together like you would if we were in the bookstore and maybe have a cup of coffee or get something and just hang for a while.
Yeah. Now would be the time for maybe some chocolate donuts or something like that.
Yeah, some pasties, even cookies or something.
Yeah, chocolate chip, right?
So if you're finished, do you have anything else you want to say before?
No, I covered it much more fully than I expected. So thank you for being patient, all of you, and thanks for attending.
Oh, you were wonderful. Wonderful way to spend the afternoon. And I will look up your other work because I'm really interested in those things.
And Dan, when you come down to see Tom in Globe, I hope you'll be able to spend a day 2 hours north of there and spend some time with me in Pleasant Valley.
I would love to. That would be awesome.
Great.
Yeah, Dan, maybe that's another kind of thing you can do is take tours of people on the Pleasant Valley tour,
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I know. I heard about the book through Marilyn Freegard up in Young, and then Joan Clark sent me the link for this virtual today. So there are people out there that are promoting, Dan.
Excellent. Fantastic.
Yeah.
That's wonderful.
Yeah, you had a nice little crowd for today. So, and it was really worth it.
Well, we're going to go buy a bunch of books for friends via your Peregrine bookstore. So,
oh, thank you. That's wonderful. Well, I guess I'm going to end the meeting unless someone wants just to.
Bye. Hi, Jay.
See you, Mike. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Richard.